So the next thing I want to talk about today was happening in Seattle, and you likely know in Seattle that they have had this, takeover of this area in Seattle. It's like it's now they're now calling it CHAZ, CHAZ is their acronym for it, and it's an area of Seattle which is called Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone. That's where the name CHAZ came from, and this idea that allegedly the entire incident, not just in Seattle and the taking over by the Antifa thugs of this area in Seattle, they try to claim, left tries to claim this is all because of what happened in Minneapolis and systemic racism and horrible treatment, all of that. So this takeover, this area in Seattle is justified. But actually, what I've been trying to push, I'm going to keep on talking about this, is you have to understand Antifa, Black Lives Matter, radical other Marxist leftist organizations in this country have been poised and waiting to pounce. Anytime the next incident happens, some incident occurs that can cause them to appear justified, that they're going to launch into absolute destruction and mayhem. That's what's happened around our country, all of the riots, which are continuing in many cities, destruction of property, destruction of statues, continuing around this country. And more Americans, and especially if you listen to my show, are becoming aware that what you're seeing in these areas is not, and has nothing at all to do with what happened in Minneapolis. Everybody condemns with what happened in Minneapolis. Everyone condemns that officer for his Officer Chauvin. Everyone wants justice for George Floyd's family, regardless of what his personal history was. Whatever George Floyd's personal criminal history, that action by that officer wasn't justified, and there is now an investigation and a prosecution underway. This is what we do in America. But you got to get what they're doing in Seattle and around this country, the destruction of statues, destruction of property, the just massive rioting and looting is not in any way related to George Floyd and the Minneapolis incident. It's about the radical left rising up because they saw an opportunity to upset America. I want to talk about Seattle a bit because they now have this area. They've actually staked it out. They've been there a while now, and they put barricades up, and they're deciding, what is permissible and who can come in and what's going to happen there. So in Seattle, I'm going to share with you in just a moment. There was a great clip, a young man who lives in Seattle. Again, speaking about making the example, who's allowed to speak up in this country and who is afraid to speak up? UC Berkeley professor afraid to put his or her name on a letter. A radical who wants to abolish the police proudly puts her name on an editorial in the New York Times. But back to our situation in Seattle. I'm going to play in just a moment a clip of a guy who's actually living there. He's so afraid of Antifa and Black Lives Matter that he's only willing to speak in an interview if they cover his face and they disguise his voice. But before I turn to having him tell you what it's really like in this area of Seattle, I want to mention again the mayor of Seattle, which is just kind of it would be laughable if it weren't so impossibly absurd. But the mayor of Seattle named Jenny Durkan, Durkan, she has alternatively described, she's, Miss Peace and Love, Miss Radical Left Democrat, and mayor of Seattle. She has described CHAZ as having a block party atmosphere, that maybe this could turn into a summer of love, her words. She also described this absolute overthrow of the rule of law in this area, the throwing out of the police, taking over the police station. She's calling that patriotic. So this is the dithering foolishness of the Democrat mayor in Seattle, calling an area where radical, violent extremists have taken over and tossed the police out. She's calling it a summer of love. Let's hear how one Seattle resident sees her summer of love when he has to live in that district called CHAZ. And here he is.
Yeah, to be honest, first I have to just say that I'm scared. I've been scared every day since Sunday, and I haven't gotten a lot of sleep because for the first time in my life in Capitol Hill, I hear gunshots every single night, and I've heard people screaming every single night outside. And they're not protest screams. I've heard protest screams, but I've also heard screams of terror out there, and I don't know what's happening out there. And that's rattling enough, just hearing the screams for the first time and not knowing what's going on. So the police had been putting up barricades about a block in front of their precinct, the East Precinct, and just holding the line there and letting the protesters come up and just holding them back. The protesters have been pushing them with umbrellas, so they have been holding umbrellas in the front to conceal their front. They've been holding them on the top so you can't see the top. And you just see this like movement screaming and coming at you in your face, and anybody would be terrified. The chance I heard them myself saying "kill the police," I've heard them say "f the police," defund the police, cops are pigs, just violent chants. And so they're coming up on the cops, and then they shine like lasers. Sunday night was the worst that I saw it. Sunday night was when they had the lasers and the strobe lights, and I hear the police, the commanding officer, the guy running the situation out here with the megaphone, and he's telling them over and over, please stop, like stand where you are. And to give the police credit, they did not budge their own line. They did not move forward, they did not move back, they just stayed still. I hear a guy with a megaphone, and he's not yelling, he's not screaming. He's just saying loudly and calmly, he said, Seattle Police Department, pull out your guns and commit suicide. And he said it over and over again. And it was like the sound of the devil, because he wasn't yelling, he meant it. The protesters started dragging dumpsters out into the middle of the road. And that was when I understood like this was part of their plan, because it was coordinated. People peeled off in specific ways, and they pulled the dumpsters out, and then people are taking cover behind the dumpster. They have book bags. I saw one guy leaning, pulling stuff out of his book bag and throwing it at the police over the top of the dumpster. No idea what that was, but it was a war going on right here.
Okay, that, my friends, is our Summer of Love, according to Seattle Mayor Jenny Durkan. Summer of Love, really patriotic, sounds good to me. But I want to make a really serious point about this. Obviously, she's clueless. Obviously, now there's some tension between the governor and this mayor of Seattle about, you got to do something about this. President Trump's been weighing in. I know many conservatives have been saying, why doesn't Trump send in the troops? But I actually think, and I said it last week, and I'll say it again, this is helping the American people wake up and recognize what today's Democrat Party is. It's not your grandmother's Democrat Party. It's not the party that used to like to stand up for the little guy, or the party that, kind of wanted to make sure we had a little bit higher taxes, so a little bit higher social spending. The Democrat Party, you name me one official who's condemned this. A little tiny bit, the governor up there in Washington saying, you probably got to do something about this. This goofball mayor is doing nothing, does not intend to do anything. I really want to get at the idea. I think that our having the President Trump and keeping the federal government out of it, not just crushing it, even though it's very tempting, and you want these people, these protesters, to understand they can't do this. It is helping the American people see where we are, where the two parties live politically in 2020, where the Republicans live, where the Democrats live, because the Democrat Party has been so overtaken and is so completely deferential to the Black Lives Matter and even the Antifa agenda. They will not criticize them. They will not say, we really can't have a country like this, we can't have law and order if this is what we do. The Democrats cannot speak up, therefore they are responsible. There was a couple follow-ons after Seattle's thing, which was so some other radical leftist young students decided they would make a little effort, do a similar thing where they live. So in the towns of Asheville, North Carolina, Portland, Oregon, Nashville, Tennessee, and Chicago, Illinois, over the weekend, there was a similar Antifa, Black Lives Matter, radical leftist attempt to take over, to replicate this CHAZ area in Seattle and do it in these other cities. But the good thing is other cities now have a little bit of warning. They have seen what's happened in Seattle. They're not playing that game. They're not going to permit it. The particular story is kind of entertaining, came out of Chicago. It was actually, I say entertaining for a couple of reasons. So this was in Chicago. A group of students had taken over the University of Chicago Police Department. University of Chicago Police Department. They took over the police department building, headquarters. They called for the abolition of the department, and so they got themselves inside the department. So they're there, they're claiming, we demand abolishment of the University of Chicago Police Department. Wisely, the University of Chicago said, you know what? They had the bathrooms all locked. They had these goofball protesters so proud of themselves, locking themselves in, but they soon realized there's no food, there's no water, and the police were not going to let delivery of food or water occur. They were not going to let these goofballs use the public restrooms in the University of Chicago Police Department building. So they're stuck inside and they need to use the restroom and they're hungry and they're thirsty and nothing, and they couldn't do a thing about it. So it was a very much of a failure, almost kind of entertaining failure of this kind of we're going to take over and show you something. So the protesters have left the building. They came out. But it was so interesting and instructive when you see how crazed this movement is. And these were, by the way, mostly white protesters. So, I mean, they were white protesters, Antifa leaning, Black Lives Matter supporting. But what was so telling was when they came out, what they were complaining about was, they talked to the media about, they were complaining that because the University of Chicago Police Department would not allow food and water to be delivered to them, would not allow them access to the restrooms, that they were denied their right to protest. They are confusing the idea that yes, we have in our Constitution a right, peaceable assembly, and that's right there in the Constitution. You don't have the right to take over public property. You don't have the right to demand that you now own or control the public police department. So they were just, they were stuck inside and kind of end up looking foolish. But the statements they made afterwards to the media really tell you how far gone, confused, and frankly, pretty much insane these people are. Because they're complaining about, here's their language, the police made it so we couldn't have a safe action. They infringed on our right to protest because police wouldn't let them hang around in the police department building. And I'm telling you folks, this is not coming up all of a sudden in the last month in America. This is decades and decades of poor instruction to our students, poor instruction to young people, what your right to peaceful protest is, that they think this is the idea. Yeah, we're going to be just like Chicago, just like Seattle. Yeah, we're going to take over and everything's going to be handed to us. On a more serious, so actually in all four of those cities I mentioned, the police were ready and just said, no, you're not taking over anything. You can get, as in some cities require, you to get some kind of permit to have a protest. You can apply for a permit. You can have a permit. You can have a peaceful protest. But you can't take over anything. And what I want to make the last point about these people taking over things is this. What they think in Seattle and other places where the protests have happened, they think that because they've taken over and they, own or control this CHAZ area, that they can issue demands and that they're in a superior position. They're now in charge. They're going to issue demands because, doggone it, we have now decided, we get to issue demands, and so we're telling you what we want. So the people at they call them, actually there's not as organized a group running this deal in Seattle as you might think, but one of the major groups, the Free Capitol Hill Movement, issued a list of 30 demands, 30 demands. And they think that they're going to be able just to hang out there until they get their demands met or they get negotiated. And I want to say, where we need to be in America, where you have to have the government be, forget this goofball mayor in Seattle, you got to have the message around this country, just as we said under Ronald Reagan back in the day, we don't negotiate with terrorists. We don't negotiate with terrorists. You don't get anything, not anything. We can have a discussion about a lot of issues, and we need to have discussions about a lot of issues. We need to be discussing a lot of issues I'll talk about in just a moment. But you get nothing at all. You get 0 on your list of demands if you do what you've done, illegally take over an area, declare it an autonomous zone. And if you listened to my show last Thursday, or if you didn't, I urge you to go back and listen to it. A great guest on, Kyle Scheidler, who was talking about the history of the Antifa movement and how the use of this term autonomous zones by the people in Seattle is not just an arbitrary term they pulled out of the air. It has historical significance. The point of it is they really are saying, just like the no-go zones are in Europe, they're saying this zone no longer is part of Seattle, is no longer a part of the state of Washington. It's autonomous, it's independent, it's the country of CHAZ. So a couple of the demands I want to share with you just to realize how absurd they are and how America needs a very, very strong crackdown on all this. But Demands include, they have the one, end capitalism. And they're trying to make the argument that capitalism is inherently racist, which has no basis in fact in any way at all. It's just a goofball thing that radical leftists thought up to say, Marxist socialists thought up to say, because they want to convince people to get behind their socialist Marxist movement. So they claim that capitalism is inherently racist. So they want to end capitalism. Yeah, I don't think so. They also want to defund all police. Not happening. They also are calling for the release of all prisoners in jails and prisons who are people of color, and have them released so they can then have a trial with a jury of their peers. Which, in a discussion I was in a couple of days ago, someone was saying, well, in that case, have the trial in prison. You know, is that who the peers are? Other people that are sitting in jail, who are their peers? But they actually are trying to claim that they should get to have the release of all people. And they actually mention specifically who committed violent crimes and are in jail for violent crimes. Those people should be released, don't you know, and have a jury of trial, a new trial with a jury of their peers. They have 4 categories of their demands: the criminal justice system, economic system, health and human services, and education. They want to abolish imprisonment. I'm going to get, obviously these are so absurd, you can just listen to them and go, oh, come on. But they are serious. These are people who actually live in the geographic borders of the United States of America and cannot figure out that America is never going to abandon imprisonment, because we have dangerous people. And every time we let dangerous people out of prison, for whatever reason we do, we have ended up with problems. We're even seeing violence from people who were let out early from jail or prison because of the COVID-19 non-problem, but let those people let out, and then you have them committing violent crimes, and the left going, well, you know, we had to let them out because we sure couldn't let them, you know, get exposed to COVID-19, so they went out and they committed violent murders and rapes. That's what's happening. This is how crazy the left is. But the other things I want to mention to you, they're also talking about replacing imprisonment with restorative and transformative accountability programs. So that the list goes on and on. And I want to make this point to say, both that the large point that we don't negotiate, they get 0. The answer is 0. If you want to sit down and have an intelligent discussion about policing practices, about whether or not that tactic that was used in Minneapolis, the knee on someone's neck, should be abolished in every jurisdiction, should be limited to certain cases, should be reviewed, people should get retrained, whatever it is, you can have those discussions. We should have those discussions. We should have reviews of officers who are routinely or in excess numbers accused of being too harsh, too rough, police brutality allegations. We can make all sorts of discussions, all sorts of changes, but when they're talking about defunding the police, when they're talking about abolishing the police, a New York Times editorial that they happily ran, you have to understand they're talking about the destruction of America. And I want to talk about the police a bit before we get to, we're going to talk in a minute about what happened in Atlanta, but this whole idea of the abolition of the police, the reason you have police in a civilized society is because you don't want to have the wild, wild west. You don't want to have vigilante justice. You don't want to have mob justice. You want order. You want order and safety for most people most of the time. We have laws that we, the people, choose lawmakers who then put laws into place. This is our entire social compact of America. We choose elected officials, and we can fire them or rehire them every election day. They make the laws, and then the laws have to be enforced by the executive branch, which comes down to the police. The reason we have police is because we have agreed to a rule of law. If you abolish the police, as these crazed persons are talking about, if you abolish police, who enforces the laws that the government, that our elected officials pass? Who decides when those laws are violated? Who decides whether to arrest someone? We're going to have the wild, wild west kind of justice. We're going to have the kind of mob justice, send out a posse every time something happens. I mean, there is no logical basis. There is no rational argument for the idea to end the functioning of police. There may be plenty of good arguments for retraining police, for reviewing police procedures, for changing the composition of the police department, for improving communications between police and civilians. Lots of good reasons for that. But the idea, when they're telling you they want to abolish the police or defund them, they're telling you they want to destroy the rule of law in America and substitute their own radical concept of right and wrong. Because understand this point. There will be, after this entire discussion is over, after we're finished with CHAZ, after things settle down in this country, there will be some entity, some people, somebody in charge. There will be either the police departments of the cities and towns of our country, and the sheriffs, and the state police. There will be police, and if we abolish all police, somebody else will still be in charge. There's not going to be just a lawless society, or a society where we have nobody in charge and everything is just beautiful and utopian and we all wander around because now that the police have been eliminated, no one commits any crime and everything is wonderful and great. There's going to be someone in charge to keep order. If it's not the police, if it's not the rule of law put in place by our Constitution, by the idea of us electing people to go to legislatures at the state level and the federal level, and then putting laws in place that the police enforce, if that system goes away, somebody is in charge. And when you watch the conduct of Antifa, of Black Lives Matter, how they've behaved over the last 4 weeks, that's who they're talking about should be in charge. That's who they're talking about. Understand, they're not talking about putting in a different set of police who are going to still help us uphold our entire construct of a civilized society. They're talking about radicals, Marxists, leftists, then being in charge and establishing a justice system under their view of justice. And people, America will be gone if that happens.